Okay, so we're live in Restream. Maybe that means we're live on socials. I'm not sure, but I'm going to officially start the webinar now and see what happens. Oh, brilliant. We're live.
We're live? All right. It's begun.
We have arrived, Daniel.
Oh, and looks like people are starting to arrive too. What a coincidence. I guess we should wait a minute or so before kicking things off.
Yeah, let's take a few minutes here for people to trickle in. And if you're here already, please say hello in the chat. I see Doug has joined us. Hey, good evening or good morning, Doug. Hope you're doing well. We've
Yeah,
got,
and where are all of you coming from? Kind of curious to see.
whereabouts are you based, Daniel, out of interest?
I'm in Waterloo, so about an hour west of Toronto in Canada.
Nice. And I'm in London in the UK. Uh, Giga. It's been a while since I've hosted a live stream, and now I remember the challenge of trying to pronounce everyone's name correctly. So I hope that I got that right. We also have Dylan from South Africa. We have the
Oh,
chat's
nice. You have
moving.
somebody from Kitchener. That's where I am. I don't even know if that's a name, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it.
And by the way, this is just people in the Zoom webinar. So if you happen to have stumbled upon this on Twitter or LinkedIn and you're wondering how to get involved, head to the Luma page, which you can find by going to the Mastra homepage. You'll see a big banner at the top, and then you can join the fun, join us in the webinar, not only to watch, but also engage. There's going to be lots of opportunities to ask questions as we progress through the event. We see 56 people here in Zoom, maybe a few more online. We'll give it just a couple more minutes, right, Daniel? And then we can jump into things.
Works for me.
Oh, Doug says the master site is looking fantastic. That's nice.
Nice. Shout out to Kenny and the others that maintain it.
Yeah. And Vlad, who designed it as well. It really is beautiful. We've got an awesome team here at Mastra. Cool. So just checking on a couple little bits here. And then, yeah, I think we can officially kick things off. Welcome, everybody, to the latest Mastra workshop. Today, we're going to be talking about building an MCP server that doesn't suck. Give me a second here, and I'll pull up the screen. And maybe, Daniel, you can help me by looking at the chat while I'm presenting in case I have any audio issues or there's any pertinent questions.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll ask you to do the same when I'm going through the demo.
I got you. Yeah. Let's do it this way. Let's share my full screen and just jump right into this. How does that look? Does it look good?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Cool. So, like I mentioned, this is a workshop on building MCP servers that don't suck. That's a little bit tongue in cheek. We can be a little bit cheeky here at Master sometimes. Ultimately, this is a workshop about building your first MCP server or evolving your current MCP server to apply the latest thinking around best practices and how to build something that's reliable and production ready that you feel really good about. We're going to start with a quick definition for MCP. And I actually wanted to ask you in the chat, have you heard of MCP before? The beautiful thing about coming to a live event like this is that we can adapt it a little bit based on your current experience level. And if you have questions, this is a great place as well. But in any case, it's going to be important to start with a shared understanding of MCP. So that's where we'll begin. I'm then going to pass it over to Daniel to talk more about how to use an MCP server to solve real problems and build a production ready MCP server. You might be familiar with some of the basic components of the specification already, like tools and resources. We're going to keep this somewhat beginner friendly by touching on the definitions. But I think the really exciting thing about today's event is that we're going to go into a bit more detail and talk about how these elements of the protocol can be applied. We'll look at tools and resources and best practices for each. We're also going to touch on some of the things that maybe some of the most beginner resources don't, but things you definitely need to take your server into production, like authentication and authorization, of course, as well as some advice on how to test your server to make sure it's robust and you feel really good about taking it into the real world and sharing it with your users. How does that sound, Daniel?
I think that sounds great.
Awesome.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
You might be wondering, who are these two folks on the screen right now? Well, here's Daniel Liu, a staff engineer at Mastra. He previously worked on the very popular Gatsby project and worked at Netlify as well. We like to call Daniel our resident MCP expert, and you can find him on Twitter at the link or the handle you see in the bottom corner there. How do you feel about that label, Daniel?
It's big shoes to fill, so I hope I don't disappoint.
The reason we say that is because Daniel has been heavily involved in developing the parts of the Mastra SDK related to the MCP server. He's read the spec in detail that you or I probably shouldn't, or we definitely won't need to, thanks to Daniel's work. My name's Alex. I'm your host today. My priority at Mastra is making sure that you have a really good experience with the product. That could be with the SDK, it could be with the documentation, it could also be about giving you the right education at the right time. And that's why I'm so excited to be hosting this workshop with Daniel to teach you more about MCP servers. I am mostly here to facilitate your questions. And I can't emphasize enough again how keen we are to hear from you. If you just want to learn about MCP in like a 20-minute YouTube video, there's probably one out there already. You can read about how to build MCP servers using Mastra by reading through our documentation. You're going to learn even more in this webinar as we go in more depth, but crucially, you get to ask questions as well. So start thinking now perhaps about some of the questions you might have. And if anything pops up during the stream, feel free to pop them in the chat. And I'll be keeping a hawk's eye on the conversation and the questions to relay what I can to Daniel and chime in where I can as well. If Daniel is our MCP expert, that would make me Mastra's resident MCP noob. And the reason why I say that is because when I joined Mastra just a few months ago, I really didn't know that much about building AI agents. I've been drinking from the knowledge fire hose and going into a lot of depth very quickly to learn about these things so I can help you with your own projects. But I'm far from an expert, and I'm almost coming on this journey with you as we get to learn a bit from Daniel's experience and explore this topic together. Before, and to let you know as well, we're going to start with some slides here, but this is not a slide heavy type of workshop. At Mastra, the workshops are all about the code. So I'm going to fly through these slides just to establish a shared understanding, and then we can jump into some code right after that. So what is MCP? If you've been working with AI or building AI agents, you've probably heard of MCP, which is the Model Context Protocol. And it's an open standard originally developed by Anthropic that connects LLMs to external systems like databases, local files, and even APIs. Now, your agent can interact with the outside world to take actions or read and acquire context, which you can then put in your context window to improve your agent's outputs. If you've been on social media at all, maybe on Twitter or YouTube, or dare I say it, maybe you've been flicking through TikTok as well, you've probably seen that everybody is talking about MCP, and it seems like the topic has really struck a chord among developers and AI engineers. Why is that? Well, basically, the ability to access external systems is a big unlock for agents. If you think back to the early days of LLMs when they first arrived and first started becoming a thing, we would give very simple inputs to get simple outputs, and these outputs would never pertain to anything beyond the knowledge the model was trained on. We could kind of sense there were more capabilities there, more power, but we needed a way to unlock it. And so the developer community started to find ways to equip these models with tools that allowed them to call out into the external world to, for example, take actions with an API, or maybe read data from a database or a file in order to provide context to the agent. However, this was very disjointed because all of these tools did things in a slightly different way. It led to an ad hoc approach, which was tedious and fragile. And it became really obvious that we needed a standard way to interface with tools and resources and external systems. That's where MCP comes into play. I think Anthropic were perhaps looking at some of the common patterns. They realized what people were likely trying to do, and they used that to develop a common abstraction that we can benefit from today in order to build really cool, really powerful, productionized agents and focus on the things that matter, right? As opposed to dealing with integration headaches, trying to make all these pieces fit together. I thought, Daniel, maybe you can tell us a bit more about how MCP works at a sort of hierarchical level or architectural level.
Yeah, and kind of like building off what you were talking about, it's all built around this protocol about how a client can talk to a server. So rather than everybody having to like come up with this protocol from scratch and just making sure that the contract is discoverable, that the contract is just the same between each client and server. So it's built on top of JSON RPC protocol. So it's just like any other protocol, like HTTP, things like that. And yeah, then the server itself decides how to communicate with like third-party APIs. So it can communicate however it wants to that.
The MCP specification has a few core components. If we think about how we consume MCP servers, the agent or the client connects to the server, and then the server exposes a few different components, namely tools, which allow your agent or MCP clients to take actions, for example, performing specific tasks like a web search or interfacing with an API. The MCP server can also expose a component called resources, which are basically different data inputs the model can access, like files or URLs or embeddings, and use these to improve the context window and improve the outputs of the model. Now, the MCP spec, if you do want to read it from cover to cover or you want to go into more depth, you'll quickly realize that there's a lot of things covered that go far beyond what you see on the slide here, prompts and elicitation to name a couple. It's a really interesting time because while this specification is in a really good place, I think people are still figuring out the best way to use it, and they're thinking about the end-to-end use cases and how to bring all these different parts together. It just so happens that tools have soared in popularity. The use case and the benefit is obvious, and you'll see tools everywhere. I'll give you some examples in just a second. Resources too are fairly prevalent, but things like prompts and elicitation, they're a bit more niche, very worthwhile, very interesting to look into. But for the purposes of today's workshop, we're going to be going into more depth about tools and resources. Before jumping into the code, the last thing really I wanted to touch on to give you some context is some of the real world applications for MCP servers. I figure you might already have some ideas for why you would like to build an MCP server. And if you're just curious in general, that's a great reason as well. Maybe let us know in the chat what you hope to get from this stream. And then as we progress, we can tailor things a bit to what you're looking for. Here are a couple of real world applications. First of all, if you're working at a company, a lot of companies are using MCP internally to connect AI agents with their internal systems, such as an internal enterprise system. If you're using a developer tool, maybe something like Cursor or Windsurf or Claude Code, these behave as MCP clients essentially, and a lot of developer platforms are adopting MCP, building their own MCP servers to give access to things like their documentation, as well as perhaps allowing the coding agent to gain access to tools and actions to do things like provision databases or programmatically interface with services, improving developer productivity. A really tangible, easy to understand example, I think one of the most popular examples is using connectors for common services. And that's this last point here. There are a lot of companies which have popular APIs like Google Drive or Slack or GitHub. They've also gone on to build MCP servers that allow you to equip your agents with access to their tools, enabling you to take actions on their platforms or even query data and put that in your context window. if you want to kind of get a sense of what's out there, we're really fortunate in that there are a few different MCP registries. Think of these a bit like NPM or Homebrew or macOS. You might search for a particular package to install. Well, an MCP registry is an index of all the different MCP servers that you may then connect to from your clients, from your MCP clients. It's quite funny actually, because when MCP first came to the surface, as I mentioned, it really struck a chord. Everybody got very excited, and everybody, it felt like, wanted to make their own MCP registry, to the point where you almost needed a registry for your registries. And that led Mastra, a little bit tongue in cheek, to create an MCP registry. But although it is a bit funny, it might actually also be genuinely useful to see what registries are out there, find the one that vibes with your way of consuming that information, and then you can explore what's out there to enhance and enrich your clients and agents. And so that's a bunch of basic information about MCP. Maybe you knew some of it, but if nothing else, we've got the same shared understanding now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand it over to Daniel, my co-host here, who's going to show us some code and walk through some of the topics we covered at the very beginning here around how to build your own MCP server and use it to solve problems. And while I stop sharing and pass it over to you, Daniel, I'm quite excited to look at the chat and see what people are thinking. And if you have any questions, I'm going to interrupt periodically to ask any clarifying questions. And
Hmm.
if I don't ask your question right away, that doesn't mean it's not been seen or ignored. I might just be waiting to ask it at the right time. So anyway, Daniel, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you. And feel free to interrupt whenever. I'll try to give some pauses so it feels less rude, you know? All right.
Sounds
So
good.
I'm going to so I have this repo. Maybe I'll post it in the chat as well if you wanted to follow along. I don't know if you have that handy, Alex.
Yes, I
Uh,
do.
or okay, sweet. Yeah, if you can just post that in the chat so people can take a look at the code. Also, how's the size for this? Should I bump up the font a little bit?
Let's go full screen if you can with cursor there, and then I think it'll look great. I turned my camera off to fetch some tea, by the way. That was very British of me.
All right. Okay, so first I'm going to just walk through what the MCP server definition looks like when you're using the Mastra MCP server class. And so you can see it's quite simple here. You give it a name. I'm just going to do like a customer analytics MCP server. You give it a version, you give it a description, you pass some tools to it, and you pass some resources, like resource handlers. And as mentioned before, there's also some other things that you can add, like prompts and elicitation. But I'm just gonna keep it simple and just do this server today. And so I thought it'd be good to start with the tool definitions first. So I'm going to just jump into this tool over here. And so another thing I want to cover while I'm walking through this is just kind of like best practices on how to write tools and just kind of like how you should like what your tools should look like. And so we had a question in the chat earlier, and it was asking like what's the scaling limit of an MCP server with the number of tools? And so that question doesn't necessarily have a definitive answer. It's kind of depends. So you have to think about you have an agent, and then that agent already has tools, and that agent can also use an MCP server, like let's say the one that you're writing, but it also may use other MCP servers. So you have to think about your MCP server is existing in an ecosystem that already has tools attached to it. So, and as you add more and more tools, it gets harder and harder for the agent to use the tools properly. So you can think of it as like you have you have a book with 100 pages and somebody asks you a question about some content in that book. It's going to take you quite a long time to like figure out, okay, which is the page that actually has the information that I need, versus if you just have 2 pages, you'll find the information pretty quick. So turns out LLMs work pretty similarly to that. The more you add to it, the less performant it becomes. So it's always a good practice to try and make your have as few tools as possible. So uh, one of the so the way I think about writing tools for an MCP server is that you don't necessarily want to map it one to one with your APIs. And so you don't necessarily want, let's say you have all these APIs like get users, get orders, instead of having all those tools for like a very focused task, you should have a tool similar to this that can explore the database. So this is a tool that uh, can run SQL queries. And so all it needs from the the LLM is a SQL query. And so for query languages that are common, LLMs are quite good at creating these queries. And so if you have a more obscure query language, you might have to give it a bit more nudging and have like a better description. So like here, I could just give a description, say like a select only SQL query, and an LLM will know exactly how to execute the SQL queries if you give it the schema. And so uh, this is one type of tool. So it's a tool that lets the AI, the LLM, explore the um, the database, and so it'll be able to, with the schema and this tool, it'll be able to get whatever information it needs from the database, rather than having multiple tools that get focused information from the database. And so I'm not going to necessarily walk through the code in this tool. It's available in in uh, in the repo posted. And so with the tool description, we have this helper. You give it an ID, a description, uh, an input schema, and then optionally an output schema as well. And then you just have the meat of the function itself. And so the other type of tool I want to talk about is something that I I think about as like a workflow. So you have these various workflows in your system, and so you don't necessarily want to map it one to one with an API, but you might have this. So this specific tool is for computing account health. And so for something like that, that's more of a workflow that you would go through, that you have to do multiple different API calls, maybe pull in multiple like integrations together. And so this is all mocked here, but essentially it's if you get information from like Datadog and other places that you like Salesforce and other places that you have data, you combine it all together and give an output. So kind of what I'm talking about is before talking about like an LLM exploration tool, and then this one is like a workflow tool. So having those two like categories of tools, I think will guide you to write better tools. And so similar here, not going to necessarily walk through uh, like the schema here. Um, and all of this stuff is just putting together like what the yeah, so this is just like mocking, like fetching NPS by account, fetching support signals, things like that, and returning an analysis here. And so the next thing I want to show is resources. So this was mentioned before, kind of a way to give extra context to your LLM. So while this is good for things like passing schema or documentation, It could also be used for more dynamic content as well. But the for this workshop, I'm just going to talk about like passing static data. So here I have the schema for the the resource is the schema here, and so uh, just like the LLM can ask for like show me all the tools available and then let me like execute the tool. Same thing here. There's a function that you can provide that when executed, it will give a list of all the resources. And then you also have to provide a function like how do you get the information from the resource. So this example is quite simple here. Uh, just we only have the schema resource and then just returning the schema resource here. And so before I jump forward a little bit, let me just show you uh, what you get here. So when you run, uh, you can attach your MCP server to your Mastra instance. And so what that gives you is once you attach it here, you can go to, let me pull up the playground. So you get this playground here. I don't have any agents. Don't have any workflows here, but I do have an MCP server. So I can click into it. I can see all the tools that are associated with my MCP server. I get the endpoints here, the HTTP endpoint, and then I could also go into the specific tools and do a query here. So let's say like select everything from tables. Oh, and so this is another interesting thing that you should work into writing in your tools. You want to provide uh, good error messages. So you see here, I tried to query a table that didn't exist. There's no such table as tables here. And so the result that the LLM will get, it'll see this here and say, oh, okay, I know exactly like where it went wrong. Let me try to execute that tool again. And so you want to give safeguards in the error messages to the LLM so that it can know how to recover from mistakes. And so, yeah, let's do from orders. And so I see my orders here. And so same thing, I can go to my other tool, check it out. Okay, cool, it works. These tools also get added to the tools directory here. And so you have MCP servers and tools. And so you get a nice little playground to help you with testing out your MCP server and your tools.
I have a question for you, Daniel, about the
Yeah.
run SQL tool. I suppose you could create like a different tool for every single thing you'd want to query, right? But you're just giving one run SQL tool. How do you reason about that, giving one general tool versus a bunch of specific ones?
So it's a way to make the so kind of what we like talked about before, like adding too many tools to like in an agent can make it confused and it's not really sure like what to do with the tools. And so the less amount of tools you can give and the more exploration you let the LLM work with, then it performs a lot better.
I can't, I wonder if anybody watching feels the same. I can't shake this question of, well, more of a feeling, which is nervousness about giving uh, agent ability to run SQL like that. I think reading is fair game, probably, but then writing could be detrimental. Have you come to feel more confident running queries against the server like this? And what led you to feel more confident?
Uh, Yeah, so you have to make sure, like with any system, that there are safeguards to make sure that actions that you don't want to happen can't happen, essentially. And so another thing I'm going to show is that I'm going to add some authentication and some different like roles. And so with this, uh, I'll show like how you can add like different like if I'm an admin to the system, then I can let it run like different types of queries, whereas like another user might only be like a customer or something like that, and then they can only run
Yeah,
certain types of queries. So you want to have these guardrails in place to make sure that certain queries can't be run.
sounds
Yeah,
great.
it's not generally like we've all seen like the horror stories of like, hey, Cursor just deleted my entire database. And
I think
so
there are definitely some considerations here, but nothing that can't be solved. It sounds like.
yeah, exactly. It's like writing any system. You want to have these guardrails in place. Cool. So I'm going to jump over to the code and
Sorry,
let's
Daniel.
walk.
Before we move
Yeah.
on, there's a couple of questions from the chat. Should we
Oh
take
yeah,
those
let's do it.
now?
Yeah, yeah.
I
That's
think
a
this is a
good segue.
Yeah, I think this is a really valid question by Stad Olf, and Dylos echoes this feeling. Stadolf wrote they're mostly struggling with the mental model of where are MCP servers supposed to run. Do the servers run on the user's machine? Do they run on my server, as in this case, Stadolf's, maybe with some auth? How do LLMs sorry, I'll stop there with the question. There's another question about auth, but we'll address that a bit later. What's the right mental model of where these MCP servers run? Because I suppose they
Mhm.
could be hosted or run locally.
Yeah, so we kind of mentioned this like in the introduction, but there's uh, two ways to run an MCP server. So one is using standard in and out. And so that would be if you ever see like an MCP client and it's you have like the server and then you have like command and it's like MPX and then it's like args, something like that. And so when you're using a client that pulls the MCP server like this, what's happening is that it's downloading, there's like a package that exists. So like an NPM package for this MCP server, you're downloading that to your local computer or wherever you're running the command, and then you're running that MCP server code locally. And so the other side of that is when you see that you pass like a URL to it. And so this would be like a remote MCP server. So this would be like somewhere hosted in like a cloud or like a serverless environment. And so it would run all that execution code, uh, not locally. Did that answer the question?
I think it's really instructive to look at some of those MCP registries because if you want to connect to like Google Drive, that's going to be hosted by Google, basically. You'll get a URL. But in some cases, it's really helpful to run an MCP server locally. For example, a lot of developer tool companies, they're creating MCP servers that expose their documentation, and then you connect Cursor or Claude Code or whatever to that local MCP server. There's no need to go through a server in that case. It can just use standard IO.
Hmm.
Um,
And I think I actually
so
have, yeah, this is our in Cursor. When you start a new Mastra project, it gives you an example, or it sets us up for you. So essentially, yeah, this is exactly what Alex is talking about, that we have this doc server. So basically turning Cursor into like a Mastra expert.
keep the questions coming. I love this. Let's get back into the workshop for the time being, Daniel.
Cool. Um, yeah, so I'm just gonna I talked a bit about auth, and so I'm just going to walk through adding this in. So I have some helper functions here already. And I have my MCP server path here. And so what I want to do is that let's use that helper that I have above. So I'm going to add auth info. And so let's see what this actually does. So this authenticate request is going to take in a header, get some parse the token, and get some information out from the token. And so all of this is just kind of mocked right now. So I have these mocks here of tokens, and then also JWTs here. And so let's see. So you get your auth info here. And so if we don't actually have any auth info, so let's see, that actually looks like what I want. But I'm going to give a better error message here. I'm just going to copy it in. And so yeah, so if the user is not authorized, uh, return with some like a good error message.
Sorry to interrupt you, Daniel.
Yeah,
I just have a feeling if I don't ask this question now, too much time will pass for it to make sense. But
yeah.
Standoff has a really good counterpoint I wanted to put to you. I gave that example of Google Drive, right? And that sounded good. But Standoff makes the point that, yeah, that MCP server could run on Google servers, but he's saying you could also run a local MCP server that has an implementation that connects to Google's APIs,
Mhm.
almost like a type of proxy. Is that a good idea? What's the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah, so a lot of MCP servers run that way as well. Um, it's also some MCP servers that people write don't aren't like hosted anywhere, and it's mainly like uh, you don't like if you're writing an MCP server, you might not want to have to like worry about the compute for it and like worry about like the infrastructure and just like managing it. So it's like, okay, you just push it off to the client. And so something like Google Drive, yeah, you can when you start the server, you could also pass like environment variables to it. Like um yeah, so you'd have like Google Drive API key, something like that, and you could start this server passing in the environment it needs. So it would be able to like authenticate. And so that's a pretty common pattern as well.
Is it? I'm not familiar with this, but Cameron mentioned anecdotally that Notion learned the hard way that you can't just wrap an API with MCP. Um, I don't. I'm curious to see the source for that, but I also wonder, does it make sense for companies to build MCP servers from scratch, or does it make more sense to build like an adapter for their existing HTTP APIs?
So I think it depends. I think when you're planning it out, you definitely want to plan it out from scratch. Um, just because you're thinking about these workflows and these like exploration tools coming at it from like a different point of view. Because like uh, the APIs that exist already are all for kind of for like built for humans, like built for that kind of like interaction. And so when you're building for the interactions that an LLM will need, the world starts to look different. And so you definitely want to plan it out. Like it could be that the way your APIs are, there might be some like a lot of stuff you could reuse. But you'll see a lot of like the early MCP servers were pretty bad. And like a lot of the companies were just basically wrapping their APIs. And so I think like Notion was like a perfect example of this. They put out like an MCP server that just essentially took all their APIs and just made them into like tools. And so recently they rewrote their entire MCP server from scratch because I think they came to that conclusion themselves, and they're like, okay, this is not a good MCP server. It was just kind of like, I think a lot of companies were riding the hype train to be like, hey, we have an MCP server like really
Yeah.
early, and so and I think it's also makes it justifiable to put more time and effort into the MCP server if a lot of people are using it and they're like, hey, this MCP server sucks, then they're like, okay, people want this. Like we pushed out like something really fast, something not very good. Now let's actually like go back to the drawing board and build something better.
Cameron shared the link to an interesting thread on X. You can find it in the chat, or perhaps by looking at Notion API on X if you're watching through the stream and you can't see the chat. Just a quick little pause moment, really. These questions are fantastic, by the way. Thank you for getting involved in the chat. We have 20 minutes left in this stream, and I think we'll need to focus on the workshop now to get everything covered in the next 20 minutes. But let us know in the chat what you prefer. Do you prefer us to Q&A like this, or do you prefer to go through the workshop? This will be really important feedback for future workshops. But for right now, Daniel, I'd like you to keep on rolling.
Yeah, all right, let's pick it up. And so I was just showing here about how to get auth information from this this helper here. And so what an MCP server uh, expects is that you set this on the request object. You set uh, this auth property with the auth info. And so this auth info actually comes from uh, like the MCP spec itself. So you can't just pass any information. And so this kind of goes back to like when we were talking about the contract. So the client has to set information that the server expects. Otherwise, if you break that contract, then the client will set some information and the server won't know how to interpret it, essentially. And so you have this auth info here. So if I look into the types, so you have token, client ID, scopes, expired at, resource, and then this here is something that people ask about a lot. And so how do you just pass arbitrary data through like a token to uh, the MCP server itself? And so this property here, extra in auth info, this is how you just stuff like whatever information that you want to pass along from like the client to the server. And so I'm going to go back out here. So I've set this auth object here. And I'm going to just add this helper here. This is just to log some extra information. So when the session gets initialized, I'm just going to log out the username here. And so you could do different stuff in this helper here. And so this is essentially all you need for the client to pass along authorization info to the server. And so now we're going to move to the server side. It's like, how does the server now interpret that authentication info? Okay, so I'm going to go to one of my tools here. And so I think my type is not showing up. I think I have to, let me, just going to install some newer versions of some packages here.
Standard.
This was a fix I pushed out yesterday, so let's hope it oops. Wait, okay, so now the types of for options are showing up. And so uh what we mentioned before, so I have this other helper here to authenticate the request. And so this is just going to get the options and do some authentication in here. And so I have that. That's mostly right. Let me just fix this up. And so this specific tool requires this authentication pattern. So I was talking before about how you can do a pattern like this to allow uh, certain tokens to access different parts of your tool. And so this property here will be checked against whatever gets pulled out of the tool itself. And so it's going to check to see if the permission matches what exists on this auth object. So if I look in here, it's just going to look, okay, does this permission include the permission that the tool requires, or the user is an admin?
I just had this really like exciting but also scary moment where that looks a lot like a web server's handler, right? Where you have like that auth check at the start. And obviously that's like a HTTP server. It's kind of exciting to think how there are more and more MCP servers emerging, and maybe it starts to eat into the amount of HTTP servers.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Then I'm going to right over here. So instead of just applying a limit, we're going to add role-based limits here. So if a user's role is read only, then let's do this. Otherwise, let them set their own limit. And so I can add that in there. And so there's different things you can play around with the information that comes off of the token that you're passing through. And so I'm going to do the same thing in this other tool here. So we're going to pass through the options. And what did I have here? For
Are
this one,
MCP
I'm going,
servers or tool calls like this, are they stateless or stateful?
so the HTTP, so initially MCP servers were done with a stateful connection with server sent events. And so that was kind of the initial like remote protocol. But they found that with server sent events, you'd need consistent connection. And so they're like, actually, that doesn't work for like the majority of environments you'd actually want to run MCP servers in. So they have this new protocol, streamable HTTP. And so the difference now is that there's like a session. And so this session is kind of like it's a token that's passed back and forth, so it knows how to like treat the connection. So the connection isn't stateful, but using this session gives it uh, the illusion of statefulness.
That was a good question by Yogesh.
And then I have in this SQL tool, so just similar things here. Going to add some limits based on a role. And so we can also give better information back here. So now we have a username, and same with, okay, we only have 10 minutes. So with just that, your server now has authorization. I'm gonna move on to talk about like how to test your server. And so with
Do we have time for one auth question?
yeah, go for it.
Or is it tight?
No, go for it.
So Cameron, who's been really active in the chat, by the way, thanks, Cameron. They asked, do models know how to pass auth info in the request to MCP servers? Or does the user need to authenticate to generate those OAuth tokens?
So that would generally be the client. And so I have an example in this testing. Let's see, new MCP client. Yeah, so you kind of led me right into the next part. And so I have this testing script here. And so the way that this works is that when you create a client, if you want to, uh, so this kind of best practices around creating a client. You can give it an optionally an ID. And so what this ID will do is prevent the client from having to, it essentially caches the client. And so it doesn't have to recreate the client every time. And so if your server doesn't have any kind of like authentication, it's just open, maybe it's just like a local package that you're using, you probably don't need a dynamic ID. But in the case where your clients are authorized, you do want to have uh, some kind of dynamic ID. So something like uh, adding like a user ID into the MCP client ID. And so you can pass, uh, so this sets up the URL, kind of like what we were looking before, uh, setting it to like the remote uh, MCP URL, and then you can also pass some headers. And so this is how you would pass like an environment variable or some kind of like token to uh, the server. And you can also add a logger and a timeout. And so this script here, um, I'm essentially just, I guess another point I wanted to touch on quick. Uh, what we've seen with a lot of MCP servers is that, um, as we know, not all LLMs are built the same. But the issue is that when people are writing an MCP server, they often write an MCP server and just test it with like, okay, my favorite LLM to use is Claude Sonnet, Claude Opus. So it's like, okay, I'm just going to be testing my MCP server with like state of the art models. And so once your MCP server is out there, you have no idea what kind of models people are going to use. People are likely to use less performant models and cheaper, quicker models. And so sometimes like the MCP server breaks down when you use those less performant models. And so it's good to test your MCP server with a range of different models just to make sure it works and it does like the LLMs are able to interpret the schema, interpret the tools and how to use them, the descriptions. And so you want to kind of like cover your own, basically cover your own asses, because it's like once your MCP server is out there and people start using it with different models, they don't think it's the model's problem. They think it's your
Right.
MCP server's problem.
It's a
And so
bit
that's
like,
something that we've kind of run into at Mastra, where it's like people write MCP servers that aren't great, and then they're like, okay, my uh, why isn't this working for me? And so there's a couple things that we've kind of added to make that integration a bit better. But at the end of the day, often it falls on the MCP server.
it reminds me of developers running everything on maxed out MacBook Pros, but not testing on lower end consumer hardware, or like maybe launching a website in Chrome, but not testing it in Safari or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if I have this script to run. Honestly, it's not that engaging to see it run, but this is a good example to kind of look at like, okay, how can I test my MCP server? Basically running it through different scenarios and different models, and just making sure that and here I have some. I also create a Mastra agent, and so I'm able to test these scenarios fairly easily. So you could with like using MCP server, MCP client, and an agent, you have this basically this whole like testing ecosystem for your MCP server. And we only have a few minutes left, and I feel like there's probably more questions that might be more interesting than just seeing me run this script.
Well, let me say first and foremost, if you would like to run the script or look at any of the code that Daniel walked through today, we'll be sharing a link in the chat. And you can, I'm going to just pull that up and share it one more time, but I'll also share it at the very end of the stream. Also, these last few minutes, if you have any questions, we'll try and get to them. There is one kind of like topic lingering in the chat that I'm also quite curious about, Daniel. So unless another pertinent question comes in, we might even end here. But Doug and Nick are touching on MCP connectors, and Doug states that MCP connectors is what Anthropic is pushing here. And he asks, are MCP connectors on Mastra's radar? I don't know what these are, Daniel. Maybe you can teach us all.
Honestly, I'm not too sure. It just kind of sounds like that's what an MCP server is. It's a
Okay, Doug,
connector.
you can teach us
And
all. What are
yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but it looks like Nick wrote MCP connectors are remote MCP servers. So that's kind of what I was thinking as well. And so maybe it's just that they're pushing for remote MCP servers instead of like client-based MCP servers.
There was a pretty, I think, advanced question earlier from Mishkin that I chose to ask at the end because it's a bit advanced, like I mentioned. They mentioned Mishkin said resources, elicitations, etc., all may or may not be supported. Is there some way to understand who supports what, almost like browser API support Mozilla provided us?
Yeah. So a server has you can here, maybe I can actually quickly pull up some code,
We have
some
3 minutes
some
left.
master code. So essentially, um, the server itself, let's see, MCP server packages. So it has this thing called capabilities that you add. And so when your server supports these things, you can, it'll basically the client will know what the server supports. And so you can see here, we support tools, logging, elicitation, and also prompts and resources if we support that like dynamically. Like if you pass it into the server, we'll also support it.
Alex expanded on MCP connector a bit in the chat. Thanks a lot for that, Alex. And thanks a lot, everybody, for watching. I've shared a link with Daniel's Twitter in the chat. Please make sure to follow Daniel. And thank you, Daniel, for preparing this code base and workshop. Genuinely, I know when I'm ready to go more detail about building MCP servers, that repo is just going to be an absolute treasure trove, and I imagine people will be using it as a reference as well. Hence, so much interest in the code. Again, you can find that link in the chat, or if you are watching live, just go to the Mastra GitHub org, and it'll be the most recently, or more or less the most recently pushed to repository over there on GitHub. You can also check me out on Twitter as a developer educator and Mastra. I'm often creating resources like YouTube videos and workshops that help you build better AI agents. Lately, I've been recording a ton of videos about Mastra on the Mastra YouTube channel. This is me kind of going on a journey to learn as much as I can about building awesome AI agents and teaching as I go. This workshop was a lesson for me as well, by the way. So it's been awesome. And if you would like to come along on that journey with me and see my videos as I learn more about Mastra, you can do that. But yeah, thanks again, everybody. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. That was really, really awesome questions. If I didn't, I think there's likely a bunch that I didn't get to, so feel free to hit me up, ask whatever you want.
Absolutely. See you next time.